Hey, it's Drybear. Diablo 4 has announced all the details for Season 2 as it's just coming up next week for us. On the 17th, we're going to get our 2.0 or our 1.2 patch for Diablo 4 that includes all the updates for Season of Blood. And I'm not going to go through the entire patch notes in this video. What I wanted to do was go through the high-level items that you want to know about if you're wanting to come back to Diablo 4. Now, if you're curious, I've moved some of my long form content onto a new channel called Drybear TV, and this is where I go through the entirety of the dev stream, explain all the details they were talking about, and have my live reaction to what they were showing on the stream itself. So if you want to check that out, go to my new channel, Drybear TV. I'll have it linked down below in the description and also in the comments. So let's dive into the 1.2.0 Season 2 Season of Blood Diablo 4 patch notes. And I'll warn you, this is very, very long. So again, I'm not going to redline this. I'm not going to go through every individual detail. We're just going to go through the biggest items so you know what's going on. Let's start with the first category, which is new content. This is the most important thing, I think, when you're talking about new releases, is what's being added to the game that didn't exist before. First of all, there's going to be a bunch of new uniques and legendaries being added to the game as well. And I'll leave a link down below for the patch notes if you want to go through all these new uniques. Some of these are pretty cool, like Druid casting a boulder, that boulder getting caught up in their hurricane and spinning around them and doing damage repeatedly, which has some nice synergy with the boulder, which has things that trigger off multiple hits as well. Some new legendaries have been added in spots that didn't exist before, and some items have been unlocked for where they can drop as well, which I think is pretty cool. They've also added 2 new Paragon glyphs for every single class, the yellow glyphs, which will give you more options for build creation and things like that. There'll be 5 new endgame bosses in addition to Uber Lilith that you'll be able to fight, and each of these will have their own fixed loot tables, which means that the range of all uniques and Uber uniques in the game will show up on one of these 5 bosses, which means you can farm them specifically to get uniques that you need. So if you're missing Tempest Roar or you're missing Ring of Mendeln or whatever it is, you can farm it by killing these 5 bosses. They are earned through unlocking materials that you get from the activities you're already doing in the game. Once you have enough of those materials, you can summon these bosses to fight them. And the materials that you use to summon these bosses are also tradable, which means that you can trade with other people if there's a specific boss you're trying to save up for. So Legion events, world boss fights, doing hell tides, things like that, you'll be doing those to get specific farmable materials to summon these bosses, and these bosses will now be part of the new end game for Season 2. On top of that, just like there was in Season 1, there'll be a new quest line, a new character voiced by Gemma Chan, so you can have that as part of your experience. There'll be new powers to collect, new mobs to fight. I think all of them are reskins of the existing ones, so there's not really crazy new content. But honestly, I'm just happy to have new bosses in the game, which I think is pretty cool. You can see all the powers listed here and links down below if you really want to check out what you can do to modify your character in Season 2. That was the new content. Let's go through the big major changes that are making to the core gameplay that you'll want to know about for Season 2. Firstly, let's talk about the big problem items that people have been talking about since the launch of the game, even in the early access and beta periods, Season 0 and Season 1, things that were problematic from the start. Resistances was one of these, and there's 2 major problems with resistances in the game. Well, there's several, but there's 2 main ones. One is that there's a big negative down applier to overall resistance based on world tier. So as you go up to world tier 4, your penalty on these world tiers is now getting majorly reduced. And they didn't mention this in the dev stream, but they did mention it in the patch notes, so that's super nice that they addressed that as well. The second was that there just wasn't enough of it, and it didn't really provide enough benefit. And even if you had enough, it was kind of meaningless in the first place. And they actually did do some work here to rework the fundamentals of resistance and also change the world tier multiplier, which I'm shocked that they didn't mention at all. So previously they had it so that you could get resistances in various places. Those resistances had a constantly applying diminishing return on them from, I think, even like 1% all the way up until you get more. So if you get 1% and you add a little bit more and you add a little bit more, it's constantly adding a diminishing return on that. So it gets harder and harder to get any value out of that. And you have that system applying to the second system, which is when you go to World Tier 3 and World Tier 4, there is a global penalty to the resistance your character had to elemental damage that was a multiplier in general. So it was like it multiplied all of your resistances down. And then on top of that, you had crazy diminishing returns affecting your resistance at all times anyway. So even if you got every Paragon resistance and everything in stats and everything built up in your gear, your resistance to elemental damage really wasn't all that great in the first place, because you'd get a pitiful amount after diminishing returns, and then you'd get that multiplied down by the worlds here. So what they're doing is they're just making it pure additive. You can add in as much resistance as you want. It'll add with no diminishing returns. And rather than a DR, they're adding a maximum cap, which means that all resistances now have a hard cap of 70%. And there are some things that exceed this, like consumables. So elixirs and incenses can go over the cap, but your gear and your paragons, for example, will not be able to raise you over the 70% cap for that resistance. So it's more just about making sure you hit the cap, kind of like old school Diablo 2. You just want to make sure you have enough. And from there, then you can look at buffs and things like that. If you really need to go over, or you're doing a dungeon that happens to be all one element, you want to react to that, then that's something that you can build for. And I think this is a very simple, it's kind of a boring solution, but it works. It's very effective. RPGs have been using this for a very long time. I am shocked they even had both an aggressive diminishing return and a global multiplier negative penalty in place, and no one questioned that along the way. But here's where we are. So that's what you just have to know about now. But also changing it so all rings, instead of just having 2 random resistances, will have all resistance on them, just like amulets. So you just want to make sure you get to at least 70% resistance cap so that you can have that there, which, you know, means that it's kind of more about building the game, right? If you get a lot more resistance in your Paragon board, maybe you free yourself up to have more slots available on your gear or stats, or maybe you put gems that have resistance on them in your amulet and your rings, which means that you can open up more Paragon slots to have less resistance in them, that sort of thing. It's more about building the puzzle together to make sure you hit the resistance cap so you take as little damage from magic as possible. And honestly, all of that is really the most important thing, is that you have the global multiplier reduced. Now it's just going to be a penalty to resistance that's flat instead of a multiplier, which makes this a lot easier to deal with. Diablo 4 has kind of abandoned their weird system of having shared reduction in damage across the board. So now all they're doing is armor is now a reduction multiplier for physical damage, and resistance is now a reduction multiplier for magical damage, just like most RPGs on the planet. So now there's no armor. Armor won't apply to resistance anymore. And because they're splitting them, they can make each of them more powerful. So armor no longer contributes to non-physical damage reduction. Resistance now contribute their full value instead of a portion of it, because they couldn't give their full value because armor was also giving magical resistance at the same time. So by decoupling those, they make it easier for them to balance, and they've increased some of the stats as well to make armor more useful and resistance more useful as they've been separated. Next, let's talk about damage buckets. And I'll have a separate video going over what this means and what these changes are in general, because I think there's a lot of people that are still confused about this change here. But this was one of the biggest critiques for Diablo 4 in Season 0 and Season 1, in that every other damage stat paled in comparison to critical strike and vulnerable, because they were true multipliers in the game. The more vulnerable damage you stacked, the more it multiplied your damage across the board, giving you orders of magnitude more damage. And if you compare that to something like damage while chilled or damage while werewolf form, those sorts of things didn't really hold a candle, because they were all being barely added on top of a base number, whereas the crit and the vulnerable were multiplying your value, which made everything else moot. This is one of the biggest critiques for Diablo, and they have taken, again, what I would argue is a pretty boring and kind of simple solution, but it's one that will work and will feel good across the board as long as they can get everything else right. So what are they doing with overpower, critical strike, and vulnerable to make them feel better? Now, I don't want to overcomplicate this because I want this video to be really short, but the idea is that they're going to take vulnerable, critical strike, and overpower and treat them the same as everything else in the game, which previously wasn't the case. They're called buckets, but they're just a grouping of stats that are added together in one calculation. This includes damage while chilled, damage while frozen, damage to stunned, damage while werewolf, damage while werebear, damage while after teleporting, things like that. All of those were added together in a single bucket together, and then they were multiplied by things that were in their own bucket, which previously was like vulnerable or overpower was a little bit separate, but not as good. And then you had crit as well. So all they're doing with this update is they're just taking the additive values, the things that you can add on your gear for vulnerable and crit and overpower, and they're moving them into the additive bucket like everything else in the game. So when you have a ring that has, this is a ring, if you have a ring that has, you know, plus 14% overpower or like vulnerable damage, let's say, that is now just going to be an additive value to your damage, just like everything else. So 14% vulnerable will be effectively almost the same as 14% lightning damage or 14% bone damage or whatever else you want to compare it to, because those values are now all going to be treated equally. Now, you're probably making a very obvious assumption here, which is that that's going to bring all of our damage down, and it absolutely will, which means that previously, if you were multiplying your damage, like say you could get, you know, like 400%, this wasn't possible, but like 400% vulnerable, and you were getting like 250% crit, that was multiplying your damage output significantly. So you have these huge multipliers on your damage output, which was giving you crazy, crazy numbers. Now that is going away, which means that your overall damage is going to go way down, and they have adjusted all of the monsters and bosses in the game to react to this change. However, there is still some multiplier left in the game, and that is there's going to be a capped and flat multiplier that gets applied for these effects. So firstly, critical strikes now always deal 50% increased damage. So this is where things get confusing for some people. You have, when you critically strike, it's going to take your total additive value of damage and it's going to multiply that by 1.5. You're always going to have a 50% multiplier on your total damage once it's fully calculated when you critically strike. Which means that if you get more critical strike damage on your gear or in your Paragon board, it's not going to increase this X multiplier anymore. It's just going to, when you crit, add that amount to your total, just like every other damage stat in the game did previously. Same thing for vulnerable. If an enemy is vulnerable, it's going to take your total damage calculation and multiply it by 20%. So you're going to get 1.2 times more damage because the target was vulnerable. And when you get vulnerable damage on your gear, on your rings, on your gloves, on your weapons, it's not going to increase this multiplier. This is a fixed value now. It's just going to be exactly the same as getting, you know, 15% earth damage or whatever it is. It's just another additive that goes to that. So rather than these being crazy runaway stats, they're just a flat multiplier. Now I'm curious how this is going to work for builds that can't actually crit, like damage over time or overpower builds. But they have reworked how overpower has worked. So there's going to be a little bit of difference on how that functions anyway. And hopefully this is actually a little bit more usable in that case. Overpower attacks now always deal up to 50% increased damage based on your current life percentage. There's another damage increase for your base life in Fortify, and another damage percentage increase that you have in life above your base life, which is the max life you've added through your build specifically. So those are the big ticket items. There's going to be a massive change in how the game feels and plays because they've brought down the core fundamental features of how damage is calculated in the game. And they've also done a sweeping pass over all mobs and monsters and bosses in the game to adjust for this, which anytime you do a sweeping adjustment for balance in PvE encounters, there's no way to get that right the first time. There's going to be some inconsistencies. Some things might be harder than before. Some things might be way easier than before. So we'll have to see how this feels when it comes out. But I think it is a step in the right direction. This system is, like I mentioned, a little bit more, it's less exciting, but it is more balanceable and more functional than the previous system. And lastly, let's wrap up with just some generally awesome things that are being added that you want to be aware of. First of all, they have finally realized, I feel like maybe someone there had finally played a minion build and realized what was going on, but they decided to take the Death's Defense passive from Necromancer, which makes it so minions had a cap of how much they can take in damage in a single hit, and they made it passive, like it's baseline for all Necro minions, whether you have the passive or not, and they've applied it to all other minions in the game. So I think this is a huge step in the right direction, and there's one more thing that they need to do for minions in Diablo 4 that every other RPG and MMO has, and for good reason, and that is they need to have a global damage reduction modifier for all minions when it comes to sources of AoE, area of effect damage. This main reason for this is any AI pet that you're going to have is not going to actively avoid standing in puddles, standing in explosions, standing in gas or poison. They're just going to be constantly taking AoE damage because they're dumb and they're not trying to avoid it in that case. So for this, it's great that they can't be one-shot by things, and having this applied to not just Necromancer minions, but also Druid minions, and possibly even the summons for Sorcerer as well. I think that's great, but they also need to do an AoE damage reduction for minions as well. And then if they have to, balance around that, because it just doesn't make any sense for a an AI minion that's not going to pay attention to standing in bad, not to have a modifier for taking reduced damage to AoE. This is common in all RPGs, all MMOs that have this. They need it as well. There's no reason why they shouldn't add it. It doesn't seem like they've mentioned it here, but you actually will get this benefit for all other minions in the game. So if you play wolves or you have all kinds of summons for your other classes, this will apply globally. All minions in the game now cannot be one or two shot, and their maximum life will determine how much damage they can take in a single instance of damage. They also are making it so Fortify is built off your maximum life instead of your base life, which is going to effectively almost double all Fortify generation, which is great because most of the time your Fortify effects are based on whether or not you are fortified, which means that your Fortify amount is equal to or greater than your current HP, which means if your Fortify gen isn't high enough, you're losing out on these benefits constantly, which makes it kind of weird. And at the end of October in 1.2.1, which is the patch that comes right after the Season 2 launch, they will be adding what looks to me like a Lost Ark training dummy to a seller in Kyovashad, which is absolutely awesome. I think any game that has tons of build variety needs a training dummy that you can test things out on and see how they work. And it looks just like the Lost Ark one. You can choose a normal, a boss, an elite that has different multipliers and benefits, right? You have things that might do more damage to bosses or less damage to bosses. You can get multiple training dummies to test out AoE and things like that. So there's tons of different ways you can do this, and it looks like bare bones, it's still going to be great. This is a huge addition. This is coming at the end of October in the first patch right after the Season 2 launch. The last thing I'll leave you with is they are improving the leveling experience. They've mentioned that it takes about 40% less time to get to 100 than it did before, and they are also extending all of the renown rewards to be across the game regardless. So if you've done it once, it's locked, it's done, it's available. All renown rewards are there for you all the way across all seasons and things like that. So it's moving in a good direction, but you let me know what you think down below. And that's what I've got for you today on these patch notes. I hope this was at least as short as it can be and informative. Leave a comment down below for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and I'll see you in the next one. If you enjoyed yourself today, leave a like down below. You can support me and my work on Patreon and view Patreon exclusive content, link in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.